2019 has been an absolutely stunning year for the Zelda speedrunning community. From Reverse Bit Magic in Skyward Sword to Barrier Skip in The Wind Waker, there's been no shortage of exciting new developments for many games in the series. All of these new discoveries have collectively shaved off more than 6 hours of time from Zelda Any runs as a whole. But not every game has been so lucky. One game that's been sitting on the sidelines watching this all unfold is The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess. Twilight Princess hasn't had any substantial discoveries this year which are utilized in any speedruns. So let's take some time to explore the bottlenecks the game currently faces and take a look at what could potentially be discovered to make the game faster. We will specifically be discussing the Gamecube Any run as it's currently the fastest version of Twilight Princess. Despite now being one of the longer 3D Zelda speedruns, for most of its history, Twilight Princess hovered around the middle of the series as far as the length of the Any run is concerned. Unlike Majora's Mask, The Wind Waker, and Skyward Sword, which all recently garnered massive sequence breaks, Twilight Princess speedrunning has been using massive sequence breaks for well over a decade, as many of its bigger breaks were discovered near its release back in 2006. The two most significant sequence breaks in the GameCube version of Twilight Princess are Early Master Sword and Early City in the Sky. Early Master Sword is performed less than 20 minutes into the run while going through the Faron Twilight. It involves using a Shadow Beast in North Faron Woods to execute a super jump and access the map's out-of-bounds collision. For those unaware, a super jump is a positional exploit of Midna's B-charge attack, where the point Wolf-Link attempts to jump attack towards is above him, causing the jump to gain more height than intended, and can be used in this circumstance to get out of bounds. From this collision, it's just barely possible to jump to the entrance of the Sacred Grove, and once inside the Sacred Grove, Wolf-Link can proceed as normal to get the Master Sword. This sequence break is extremely useful for the Any run, due to how early it's possible to perform in conjunction with how the Master Sword allows us to transform between Human Link and Wolf Link at any time. This ability provides the backbone for the first half of the game's Any route, and ultimately saves about 20 minutes, as being able to transform between Link's two forms this early allows for the use of further sequence breaks such as Faron Escape and Gorge Skip. Later in the route, after having completed the Arbiter's Grounds, runners perform Early City in the Sky. This sequence break uses a Midna transform from Human Link to Wolf Link as a way of clipping through the owl statue which normally blocks the hallway to the Sky Cannon. The Sky Cannon can then be warped to Lake Hylia, repaired, and used to grant access to the City in the Sky, skipping the second half of the Snow Peak Mansion, all of the Temple of Time, and the entire Skybook quest, saving just over an hour. Going through the game casually, most players probably assume that you need to collect all 3 missing mirror shards to reconstruct the Mirror of Twilight, as that's what Midna tells you to do. However, the game intends for players to obtain the shards in a specific order, first getting the one from Snow Peak, then from Temple of Time, and finally from City in the Sky. Because of this, the game only checks for the mirror shard from the City in the Sky as a means of determining if it should open up the Palace of Twilight, allowing for us to skip completing the Snow Peak Mansion and Temple of Time. These two sequence breaks clearly save quite a lot of time, and when combined with all the other minor breaks and skips there are, make the Any speedrun a pretty broken and interesting watch. However, both of these major sequence breaks were discovered all the way back in 2007. Since those discoveries, no other skips have even come close to cutting out as much of the game as these two have. Even with its sequence breaks, Twilight Princess is still a somewhat long speedrun compared to the other 3D Zelda games, partly because it's simply a long game. The game has a total of 9 full dungeons, 7 of which the Any speedrun has to go to, with 5 being for actual completion and 2 being for their necessary dungeon items. Each dungeon that gets completed is necessary to progress past different roadblocks which we haven't figured out how to get around any other way. The Lakebed Temple is necessary to obtain the last fused Shadow Piece, which sets off a chain of events necessary to access the Gerudo Desert. The Arbiter's Grounds is necessary to access the Mirror of Twilight area. The City in the Sky is necessary to access the Palace of Twilight. The Palace of Twilight is necessary to break the barrier around Hyrule Castle, and Hyrule Castle is of course necessary to defeat Ganondorf and beat the game. Of the 2 dungeons we enter, but don't complete, the Forest Temple is home to the Gale Boomerang, which is an integral part of the speedrun as it's used to execute the long jump attack exploit in many places. Similarly, the Snow Peak Mansion houses the Ball and Chain, which is a required item. And this is where one of the more annoying roadblocks comes into play. The sole purpose of obtaining the Ball and Chain in any version of a Twilight Princess speedrun is to stun Zant during his Blizzetta phase. That's it. It's not required anywhere else in the run. Sure, it can save a few seconds here and there, maybe, but we spend 10 minutes going out of our way to get this item all for that one phase. During the Blizzetta phase, Zant can't be stunned by any other form of damage. Not our sword, not explosives, not even rolling into him with the iron boots, which yes, is an attack in this game. There are no types of attacks or interactions that can stun Zant during his Blizzetta phase, except for the Ball and Chain. That's perhaps the smaller of the roadblocks this game faces. One of the bigger ones has to do with being able to access the Gerudo Desert via Fire's Cannon. As I mentioned previously, completing the Lakebed Temple is necessary to gain access to the desert, as obtaining the last fused Shadow Piece sets off a sequence of events which leads to being shot off in Fire's Cannon to the desert. But that's only one of 2 requirements. The other requirement is to clear the Lanayru Twilight. However, in order to start the Lanayru Twilight cleansing process, the meteor that falls in Death Mountain must be warped away to break the ice in Zora's domain. And this meteor cannot spawn until the player has cleared the Elden Twilight as well, furthering the list of dependencies for accessing the desert. And of course, as we established earlier, this is all necessary to ultimately get into the Palace of Twilight and then eventually Hyrule Castle to beat the game. With all of these dependencies, is there even potential to skip any of this? Surprisingly, there is one potential theory for accessing the Palace of Twilight early, without needing to complete the City in the Sky or the Arbiter's Grounds. During the sequence where Link gets launched off to the Gerudo Desert, Midna reveals some key story information during multiple flashback cutscenes in the Twilight world, and these cutscenes are set in the Palace of Twilight. This is not a movie file the game is playing back. The game changes the current map to be the Palace of Twilight during this part of the cutscene, and this has exploitation potential. See, one interesting property about Twilight Princess is that death typically has priority over cutscenes. If the game attempts to load Link into a cutscene and he has 0 health, he dies and respawns on the current map. So if we could die into this cutscene in the Palace of Twilight, we'd respawn in the Palace of Twilight. Theoretically, this sounds great, but attempting to pull this off has some practical issues. This cutscene in the Palace of Twilight takes place after Link arrives in the Gerudo Desert, and to get to the Palace cutscene, we must first make it through the previous cutscene that takes place on the desert map. So if we wanted this death theory to work, we'd somehow have to die while this first cutscene is playing and let it play out before the game loads the Palace of Twilight to give us the game over. And I'm not really sure how we'd go about dying in a situation where we don't have any control over Link. Also, despite the fact that this would bypass the need to complete the Arbiter's Grounds and the City in the Sky, with our current knowledge, we still need the double claw shots to complete the Palace of Twilight, which means we would still need to enter the City in the Sky for them. This then cascades into a dependency for the spinner, since we'd need to use it in City in the Sky to access the double claw shots. And then that means that somehow we need to get into the Arbiter's Grounds without watching the desert introduction cutscene, and yeah, we can see why this turns into a less and less likely possibility. If we want to skip both the Arbiter's Grounds and City in the Sky, we'd have to somehow get all the way into Zant's boss room for the Palace of Twilight, or skip the Palace of Twilight completely. Much like the formidable barrier in The Wind Waker, Twilight Princess has a barrier that surrounds Hyrule Castle to keep players from accessing it early. This barrier forms after the player completes the Midna's Desperate Hour portion of the game. Before that, Hyrule Castle is blocked by 2 guards and a closed door. Naturally, being able to bypass these obstacles has been a huge point of interest for those in the speedrunning community since the release of the game. But unfortunately, there's not really a lot we have to work with here. In this area, almost all of Link's inventory items and sword are restricted and unable to be used, with the exceptions being bottles and the lantern. Additionally, Wolf Link's speed is hindered and Human Link cannot jump in all Castletown areas. The only real lead that there is in this area is the use of Map Glitch. Map Glitch is a technique that works in the original European and North American versions of the game, and disables loading triggers which are tied to standing on specific collision polygons. It's performed by attempting to map warp away with D-pad right and calling Midna with Z on the same frame. Midna's text interrupts the cutscene of warping away, but by this point the map's loading zones have already been disabled. Once loading zones have been disabled, we can get out of bounds by going around the area's wall collision as it ends after the Castletown loading zone. From here, we can make our way up to the giant door which is in our way, where we unfortunately get blocked by a wall that extends farther out of bounds than the floor collision. Even if we get around this wall, there's another invisible one behind it. Now you might be thinking, wait, how is this even a possibility if loading zones become disabled? Isn't the loading zone into Hyrule Castle then disabled also? Well, the loading sequence for Hyrule Castle is not caused by Link walking over some specific collision. Rather, the loading sequence is triggered by opening the door to the castle, and these triggers still work when Map Glitch is activated. If early Hyrule Castle was a reality, we would thankfully be able to get around the requirements for the double claw shots and spinner in the final climb, thanks to the use of Gale Boomerang long jump attacks and damage boosting, so we don't run into any dependency problems for the later dungeons. Despite the fact that not very many things have been found recently for the Any% run, that doesn't mean that things aren't being found at all, but rather new techniques which have been discovered simply don't end up being useful for the Any% run. Earlier this year, a new way of duplicating fishing rods was discovered and can be used to pull off some pretty interesting memory fragmentation glitches. Unfortunately, fishing rod duping is limited to where you can bring Epona, and any memory which is fragmented becomes properly freed upon loading a new area. So it can't be used to, say, unload the Hyrule Castle barrier, as far as we know. One specific use runners had hoped for was a way to unload the giant gate in Arbiter's Grounds, which requires collecting Poes to raise back up. But obviously we can't bring Epona into dungeons, so this wasn't really a possibility. In the original game, at least. Twilight Princess HD actually has the ability to duplicate the fishing rod almost anywhere using the quick transform function it implemented once the player obtains the Master Sword. So while the HD version of the game can technically skip the gate this way, it's significantly slower to do so since the amount of memory that we'd be required to fragment is over 20 times higher than that of the original game. Twilight Princess is arguably the least broken 3D Zelda game these days, but the community is always trying to figure out new ways to potentially save time. And of course, we still have a lot more to learn about the game. Even with it being the slowest 3D Zelda, I would still recommend checking out both the current Any% record by fellow speedrunner Demon and the Twilight Princess TAS, which showcases how fast the game can be if a runner is not limited to being human. And of course, if you enjoyed this episode of Elusive Glitches, I would recommend checking out the rest of the series as well. Also, special shoutouts to Dragonbane for reviewing the information that I wrote in this script. Thank you all for watching, and have a nice day.